The pizza box was already getting cold by the time Sophie realized the address on the receipt belonged to the Hale mansion. And suddenly, nobody inside Tony's Pizza wanted to look at her anymore. The kitchen went quiet in that strange way places do when people are pretending not to listen. Tony wiped his hands on a grease-stained towel and avoided eye contact. "You can skip that delivery," he muttered. "Nobody likes going up there." Sophie tightened her fingers around the cardboard box. "Why?" Tony shrugged too fast. "Old man's crazy. Sends food back. Yells at drivers. Last guy quit after delivering there." That should have scared her. Honestly, maybe it would have scared a normal 13-year-old girl. But Sophie Mercer stopped being a normal kid around the same time her mother started cleaning hotel bathrooms during double shifts and pretending canned soup counted as dinner. Fear didn't pay rent. Fear didn't keep the lights on. And fear definitely didn't stop eviction notices. Outside, rain hammered against the shop windows while neon signs flickered over puddles black as oil. Sophie glanced at the clock. 10:47 p.m. Her mom was probably still awake in their apartment pretending not to cough, so Sophie wouldn't worry. Earlier that afternoon, her mother had nearly collapsed while scrubbing floors at the Riverside Suites Hotel. Her manager still made her finish the shift before sending her home. No health care. No paid leave. No mercy. Just another exhausted maid replaced the second she slowed down. Sophie swallowed hard and reached for the delivery receipt. Victor Hale, 1 Hawthorne Ridge tip. Cash. Tony grabbed her wrist gently before she could leave. "Kid," he said quietly. "That man hasn't spoken kindly to anybody in 20 years. Sophie gave him a tired little smile. Then maybe nobody's knocked on his door hungry before. 20 minutes later, the bus dropped her 3 blocks from the estate. The rain had turned vicious. Cold water soaked through her sneakers as she climbed the winding hill toward the enormous iron gates. The Hale mansion sat above the city like a dark castle, all black windows and stone walls disappearing into fog. Rich people always built houses. That looked lonely. Sophie pulled her hood tighter and buzzed the intercom. Static crackled. Then a deep voice growled through the speaker. "You're late." She blinked. The storm slowed the buses. "I didn't order excuses." The gate buzzed open. "Nice guy?" She walked carefully up the long driveway, staring at fountains taller than her apartment building and expensive cars sleeping under covered awnings. By the time she reached the front door, her hands were shaking from cold. She knocked once. Nothing. Twice. Still nothing. Then suddenly the giant wooden door swung inward, and Sophie almost dropped the pizza. The man standing there looked less like a billionaire and more like somebody carved out of old stone. Victor Hale was tall, even with age bending his shoulders slightly. Silver hair slicked back. Sharp gray eyes. A dark sweater beneath an expensive coat. But it wasn't his appearance that unsettled her. It was the sadness. The kind that sat behind someone's eyes for so long it stopped looking temporary. Victor stared at her soaked clothes with obvious irritation. "You took 38 minutes. Sophie held out the pizza quickly. "Sorry, sir." He reached for the box, but paused. His eyes dropped to the small silver keychain hanging from Sophie's backpack. An old military tag. Worn. Scratched. Faded almost white with age. Victor froze. His fingers twitched slightly. "Where did you get that?" Sophie looked down. "Oh, this." She touched the tag carefully. "My grandpa gave it to me before he died." Victor's face changed instantly. Not softer. Worse. Like someone had punched straight through his chest. Rain hissed behind her while silence swallowed the doorway. "What was his name?" Victor asked quietly. Sophie shifted nervously. "Walter Mercer." Victor's breathing stopped. Actually stopped. Sophie saw it happen. The old man staggered backward 1 step, gripping the edge of the door so hard his knuckles whitened. "No," he whispered. Then louder. "No, that's impossible." Sophie's stomach tightened. "Sir." Victor stared at the military tag like he'd seen a ghost crawl out of the grave. Finally, his voice cracked. "When did Walter die?" 3 years ago. Victor looked. Away fast. Too fast. But not before Sophie saw tears gathering in his eyes. Real tears. The kind grown men try hiding from strangers. And suddenly this terrifying billionaire didn't look powerful anymore. He looked broken. Victor swallowed hard. Then he asked the question that changed everything. "Did your grandfather ever mention a man named Victor Hale?" Sophie blinked slowly. Because she knew that name. Her grandfather used to whisper it sometimes during bad nights when old war memories crawled back into his dreams. He called you Bobby, she said softly. Victor Hale started crying the second those words left her mouth. And somewhere deep inside the mansion, something heavy crashed onto the floor. Victor Hale cried like a man who had spent 30 years trying not to. Not loud, not dramatic, just silent tears sliding down the face of someone too proud to let grief breathe. Sophie stood frozen in the doorway holding the pizza box while rainwater dripped from her sleeves onto the marble floor. For a few terrifying seconds, she thought maybe the old billionaire was having some kind of medical emergency. Sir? She asked carefully. Victor wiped his face quickly, embarrassed by his own reaction. His breathing sounded uneven now. How do you know that name? He whispered. My grandpa used to say it during his nightmares. Victor stared at her. Nightmares. That word alone dragged him backward 40 years. Jungle rain, gunfire, smoke, blood, and one man screaming his name through the chaos. Bobby, run. Victor suddenly turned away from her and walked deeper into the mansion without another word. Sophie blinked. Your pizza? Victor stopped near a fireplace large enough to fit her entire apartment inside. Come in before you catch pneumonia. She hesitated. Every adult in her life had warned her about entering strangers' homes, especially rich strangers. But something about the old man no longer felt dangerous. Lonely maybe, haunted definitely, but not dangerous. Sophie stepped inside slowly while thunder rolled outside the massive windows. The mansion felt cold despite the expensive furniture and glowing chandeliers. It didn't feel like a home. It felt like a museum, where happiness used to live. Victor took the pizza box from her carefully this time. What's your mother's name? Rachel Mercer. Victor's eyes narrowed instantly. She works at the Ashford estate downtown? Sophie looked surprised. Yeah, how'd you know? Victor gave a bitter little laugh. Because Richard Ashford brags about his staff the same way other men brag about cars. Sophie looked down awkwardly. Well, she doesn't work there anymore. Victor noticed the change in her face immediately. What happened? Sophie swallowed. She got fired last week. For what? They said she stole jewelry. Victor's expression hardened instantly. And did she? No. Sophie snapped louder than intended. Then her face flushed red. Sorry. Victor studied her quietly. You believe your mother. I know my mother. That answer hit him harder than she realized. Because Walter Mercer used to speak exactly the same way. Simple. Direct. Certain. Victor walked toward an old wooden cabinet near the fireplace and opened a drawer. Inside sat dozens of photographs. Old military medals. Faded letters. Pieces of a life nobody else had cared enough to remember. His fingers trembled as he searched through them. Finally, he pulled out a black and white photo. 3 soldiers stood beside a helicopter barely held together by duct tape and luck. Young, dirty, exhausted. Victor handed it to Sophie. She gasped softly. That's Grandpa. Walter Mercer stood in the center smiling crookedly at the camera. And beside him, a painfully young Victor Hale. Except back then he looked terrified instead of powerful. He saved my life twice, Victor said quietly. Sophie looked up slowly. My grandpa never talked much about the war. That's because good men usually don't. Victor sat heavily in a leather chair near the fire. For the first time in years, he truly looked old. Walter pulled me out of a burning transport truck in Da Nang, he said. I was trapped. Fuel everywhere. Bullets coming through the metal. His voice roughened. Everyone else ran. But not Grandpa. Victor shook his head slowly. No. Walter came back for me. The room fell silent except for rain tapping against glass. Sophie carefully studied the photograph again. Her grandfather had died 3 years earlier in a tiny apartment with broken heating and unpaid medical bills. And somehow the scared soldier beside him had become one of the richest men in America. Life was weird like that. Victor suddenly looked at her backpack again. Why does a 13-year-old deliver pizza at 11 at night? Sophie shrugged too casually. My mom can't work right now. Why? She hurt her back cleaning hotel rooms after the Ashfords fired her. Victor's jaw tightened. How bad? She pretends it's fine. Sophie forced a smile. But sometimes she cries in the shower because she thinks I can't hear her. Something dark flashed through Victor's eyes. Not pity. Anger. Cold anger. How much do you owe in rent? Sophie stiffened immediately. We're handling it. That's not what I asked. She looked embarrassed now. 2 months. Victor nodded once like he was filing the information somewhere dangerous. Then suddenly his eyes landed on something sticking out of Sophie's backpack. An old red notebook. Worn edges. Grease stains. Walter Mercer's name written inside the cover. Victor froze again. That notebook, he said quietly. Where did you get it? Oh. Sophie pulled it out carefully. Grandpa's recipe book. Victor's face lost all color. Because he recognized it instantly. And if he was right about what was hidden inside that notebook, then somebody powerful had lied for a very long time. A loud crack of thunder shook the mansion. But somehow it wasn't the storm that suddenly scared Victor Hale the most. Victor Hale hadn't seen that red notebook in almost 25 years. And it absolutely should not have still existed. Sophie watched the billionaire stare at the recipe book like it might explode in his hands. You okay? She asked carefully. Victor didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached for the notebook slowly. May I? Sophie nodded. My grandpa used to write pizza recipes in there. Victor opened the cover carefully, almost reverently. The pages smelled faintly like garlic powder, old paper, and cigarette smoke. Walter Mercer had carried that notebook everywhere after the war. Victor remembered because he used to make fun of him for it. You writing recipes or military secrets in there, Walt? Walter used to laugh every time. Maybe both. Victor's stomach tightened. Back then he thought it was a joke. Now he wasn't so sure anymore. His fingers flipped through handwritten sauce recipes, grocery lists, reminders, tiny notes written in Walter's crooked handwriting. Then suddenly Victor stopped. Folded between two pages was an old photograph. Not military. Not family. A house fire. Victor's blood turned cold. The Ashford estate. 25 years ago. The night everything changed. Sophie leaned forward. What is it? Victor stared at the burned photograph silently. Because officially, the fire had been ruled accidental. Unofficially, Victor had always suspected Richard Ashford knew more than he admitted. Back then, Victor and Richard were business partners trying to build a luxury real estate empire. Then the estate fire destroyed critical financial records tied to millions of missing dollars. A week later, Walter Mercer suddenly quit working security for Ashford. And 3 months later, Victor's closest friend disappeared from public life forever. Victor slowly looked up at Sophie. Did your grandfather ever talk about the Ashfords? She frowned slightly. He hated them. Did he say why? Not really. Sophie shrugged. He just said rich people know how to bury ugly things. Victor leaned back slowly. God help him. Walter knew. The old soldier had known the truth this entire time. A sharp pain pressed against Victor's chest. Because while he climbed into billion-dollar boardrooms, Walter Mercer spent decades struggling alone with secrets heavy enough to destroy powerful families. Sophie glanced nervously toward the windows. Rain still hammered outside. I should probably get home. Victor ignored that. Your mother was accused of stealing jewelry, he said quietly. Who accused her? Mrs. Ashford. Victor gave a humorless laugh. Of course. Celeste Ashford. The queen of fake smiles and poisoned kindness. She searched my mom's locker herself, Sophie continued softly. Then suddenly the necklace appeared. Victor's face darkened. And nobody questioned it. They said rich people don't lie about things like that. That sentence hit harder than Sophie realized. Because Victor knew exactly how often rich people lied. Especially when money was involved. Especially when reputations were at risk. Victor closed the notebook carefully. Your mother didn't steal anything. Sophie blinked. How do you know? Because the Ashfords have been covering tracks since before you were born. Silence filled the mansion again. Then Sophie laughed nervously. You sound like Grandpa. Victor looked at her sharply. What do you mean? He used to say the Ashfords destroyed people quietly. Victor's pulse quickened. Destroyed people quietly. Walter used those exact words in 1998 after the fire investigation vanished mysteriously. Victor stood abruptly and walked toward the giant windows overlooking the city. He suddenly felt sick. All these years, he told himself the past was buried. But buried things had a nasty habit of surviving. Especially when honest men refused to let go. Behind him, Sophie shifted awkwardly. Mr. Hale? Victor. What? Call me Victor. She hesitated. Okay. Victor. The name sounded strange after decades of hearing fear and obedience from everyone around him. Victor turned back toward her. When was the last time your family ate dinner together? Sophie looked confused by the question. Probably Christmas? And tonight? She smiled weakly. My mom told me to grab fries after work because there's not much food left. Victor closed his eyes briefly. Walter Mercer's family was starving while men like Richard Ashford hosted charity galas pretending to care about poor people. That rage inside him deepened. Cold. Precise. Dangerous. Suddenly headlights flashed outside the mansion gates. A black SUV pulled into the driveway. Victor recognized it instantly. Richard Ashford's vehicle. Victor's expression hardened. "What's wrong?" Sophie whispered. Victor stared toward the driveway. "Unfortunately," he said quietly, "your night just became very complicated." The front doorbell echoed through the mansion, and Victor Hale already knew the man standing outside was about to lie directly to his face. Richard Ashford smiled before the front door even opened. That was always his first weapon. Charm. Expensive. Practiced. Empty. Victor watched him step into the mansion wearing a camel-colored overcoat worth more than Sophie's family made in 3 months. Richard stopped cold the second he noticed the girl standing near the fireplace. For one tiny moment, panic flashed across his face. Then it vanished behind another polished smile. "Well," Richard laughed softly, "this is unexpected." Sophie immediately recognized him. Her shoulders tightened, because this was the man whose family destroyed her mother's life. Richard looked at her like she was something unpleasant stuck to his shoe. "Sophie Mercer, right?" Victor noticed that. He noticed everything. "Yes," Sophie answered quietly. Richard removed leather gloves slowly. "You shouldn't be here." Victor's voice cut through the room instantly. "She's my guest." Richard glanced toward Victor carefully now. Something shifted in the air between the two older men. "History. Ugly history. I came to discuss tomorrow's acquisition meeting," Richard said casually. "I didn't realize you were entertaining delivery staff." Sophie looked down immediately. Victor saw it happen, and something inside him snapped. "Enough," Victor said coldly. Richard blinked. "I beg your pardon." "You framed her mother." The room went dead silent. Richard actually laughed. "That's absurd." "Is it?" Victor stepped closer. "You planted stolen jewelry in Rachel Mercer's locker because Celeste needed someone blamed before the police started asking questions." Richard's smile weakened slightly. "You're making serious accusations." Victor stared directly into his eyes. "And you're sweating." Richard's jaw tightened instantly. For years nobody challenged him like this. Not publicly. Not directly. But Victor Hale no longer cared about business etiquette. Not after seeing Walter Mercer's granddaughter delivering pizza in the rain to survive. Richard suddenly looked towards Sophie again. "You should go home now." Victor moved between them instantly. "She stays." That answer clearly irritated Richard. "You're getting emotional over nothing," Richard muttered. "This girl's mother is a maid, Victor. People like that steal sometimes." Sophie flinched visibly. Victor's face turned terrifyingly calm. "Walter Mercer once dragged my bleeding body through enemy fire," he said quietly. "So be very careful how you speak about his family." Richard froze. "What?" Victor stepped closer. "She's Walter's granddaughter." And suddenly Richard Ashford looked genuinely afraid. Not shocked. Afraid. Sophie noticed it too, which meant Richard already knew exactly who Walter Mercer was. Victor caught that reaction immediately. "Interesting. Very interesting." Richard recovered fast, though. "You're confused," he said quickly. "Walter was unstable near the end." Victor laughed once. "Low and dangerous. Still lying after all these years." Richard's eyes narrowed. "What exactly do you think you know?" Victor held up the red notebook. Richard's face lost color instantly. "There it is. Fear. Real fear. You remember this?" Victor asked softly. Richard stared at the notebook like a loaded gun pointed at his chest. "That should have been destroyed," he whispered before realizing he said it out loud. Nobody moved. Then slowly Sophie asked, "Destroyed why?" Richard immediately straightened his posture. "I'm leaving." Victor blocked the doorway. "No," he said quietly. "Not yet." For the first time in decades, Richard Ashford looked cornered. Victor stepped closer. "Walter kept records, didn't he?" Silence. "Records of the fire." Richard's breathing changed slightly. Victor saw it. "Who died that night, Richard?" "Watch yourself." "No," Victor snapped suddenly. "You watch yourself." The force in his voice startled Sophie. Victor rarely shouted. But now decades of buried guilt were clawing upward all at once. "You let Walter carry the blame alone," Victor continued, "while you protected your money." Richard's voice dropped dangerously low. "You have no proof." Victor lifted the notebook slightly. "Maybe I do." Richard stared at Sophie. Not like a child anymore. Like a threat. And that terrified Victor more than anything else tonight. Because rich men only fear people who can ruin them. Richard adjusted his coat slowly. Then he smiled again. "But," This smile looked rotten. Be careful who you trust, Victor. His eyes shifted toward Sophie. Sometimes families inherit more than old stories. Then he walked out into the storm. The giant front doors slammed shut behind him. Silence swallowed the mansion again. Sophie's voice shook slightly. What does that mean? Victor stared at the notebook in his hands. Because suddenly he remembered something Walter once told him after the fire. If anything happens to me, make sure the girl never finds out. Back then Victor thought Walter meant Rachel. Now he wasn't so sure. And somewhere inside that old notebook, a secret waited patiently to be uncovered. Sophie didn't sleep that night. Neither did Victor. By 2 in the morning, the storm finally passed, but the mansion still felt heavy with tension. Victor sat alone in his office, staring at Walter Mercer's notebook spread open across the desk. Page after page of recipes. Tomato measurements. Old grocery lists. Random dates. Nothing obvious. But Walter Mercer had been military intelligence before becoming a security guard. If he hid something here, it wouldn't be easy to find. A soft knock interrupted Victor's thoughts. Sophie stood awkwardly in the doorway, holding a blanket around her shoulders. You got any cereal? Victor blinked. What? You rich people always got fancy kitchens. For the first time that night, Victor almost smiled. 10 minutes later, they sat together in the enormous kitchen eating cereal at 3 in the morning like two people who didn't belong in the same universe. Sophie looked tiny sitting beneath crystal chandeliers. Victor looked exhausted enough to finally seem human. My mom's probably freaking out, Sophie admitted quietly. Victor nodded. I already sent a driver to explain everything. She relaxed slightly. Then her eyes drifted toward the notebook beside him. Did you find something? Victor hesitated. No, that wasn't entirely true. Because hidden inside several recipe pages were strange number patterns. Coordinates maybe. Dates. Walter had definitely encoded something. Victor just hadn't solved it yet. Sophie rubbed tired eyes. Grandpa used to say recipes were easier than people. Victor chuckled softly. He used to burn toast constantly. Her eyes widened. You knew that. He once almost burned down our barracks trying to make grilled cheese. Sophie laughed unexpectedly. A real laugh. And hearing Walter's granddaughter laugh inside his empty mansion hurt Victor more than silence ever had. Because Walter should have lived long enough to hear it himself. Suddenly Victor's phone buzzed sharply across the counter. Unknown number. He answered immediately. A distorted voice spoke quietly. Stay away from the Mercer girl. Victor's expression hardened instantly. Who is this? You're digging where you shouldn't. Click. The line went dead. Sophie noticed his face change. What happened? Victor forced calm into his voice. Nothing. But his instincts screamed otherwise. Someone was watching. The next morning Victor drove Sophie home personally. Her neighborhood looked even worse in daylight. Broken sidewalks. Boarded windows. Graffiti covering abandoned stores. Victor hated how normal poverty had become to everyone except the people trapped inside it. Children played basketball beside overflowing dumpsters while tired parents hurried toward jobs that barely kept them alive. Walter Mercer survived war only for his family to fight a different kind afterward. That realization made Victor sick. Rachel Mercer opened the apartment door slowly when Sophie knocked. The second she saw Victor standing behind her daughter, her face drained of color. Oh my God. She looked terrified. Not impressed. Terrified. Mom, it's okay, Sophie said quickly. But Rachel grabbed her daughter immediately. What did you do? Victor understood instantly. Poor people learn early that wealthy men rarely appear with good intentions. Rachel looked exhausted beyond words. Dark circles beneath her eyes. Back brace under an old sweater. Hands cracked raw from years of cleaning chemicals. And yet somehow she still resembled Walter around the eyes. Victor introduced himself carefully. Rachel nearly collapsed when she heard the name. Bobby, she whispered automatically. Victor froze. Walter really had talked about him. Rachel covered her mouth quickly. My father used to mention. You. Victor nodded slowly. I know. For a moment none of them spoke. Then Rachel's face hardened. If this is about the Ashfords, we don't want trouble. Victor stepped inside the apartment quietly. You already have trouble. That answer scared her. Sophie suddenly interrupted. Mom, Mr. Hale thinks Grandpa hid something. Rachel looked alarmed instantly. No, Victor noticed that reaction immediately. Rachel knew more than Sophie realized. What did Walter tell you before he died? Victor asked carefully. Rachel shook her head too fast. Nothing important. Victor stared at her. Another lie. Before he could press further, Sophie's phone buzzed. Tony from the pizza shop. She answered quickly. Then her face fell. What? Victor's chest tightened. Sophie lowered the phone slowly. They fired me. Rachel looked horrified. For what? Tony's voice still echoed through the speaker. Somebody paid the owner to let you go. Victor already knew exactly who. And as he stood inside Walter Mercer's freezing apartment, one terrible realization settled into place. Richard Ashford wasn't trying to silence Rachel anymore. He was trying to silence Sophie. Victor Hale hadn't been truly afraid in years. Not during hostile takeovers. Not during lawsuits. Not even during the market crash that nearly destroyed half his empire. But watching Sophie lose her pizza job because powerful people felt threatened by a 13-year-old girl, that terrified him. Because innocent children only become targets when adults are hiding something monstrous. Rachel sat heavily at the kitchen table while Sophie tried pretending the firing didn't hurt. It's okay, Sophie said too brightly. Tony probably needed somebody older anyway. Victor recognized survival acting when he saw it. Walter used to do the same thing after firefights. Smile first, bleed later. Rachel looked toward Victor nervously. You need to leave us alone. Victor stared at her in disbelief. They're threatening your daughter. That's exactly why you need to leave. Her voice cracked slightly. Fear. Real fear. Victor moved closer carefully. What happened the night of the fire, Rachel? She immediately stood up. Stop. Walter. Died carrying secrets meant for somebody else. I said stop. Sophie looked between them confused and scared. Victor lowered his voice. Richard Ashford is panicking because he thinks Walter left evidence. Rachel's eyes filled with tears instantly, which told Victor everything. She knew. Maybe not all of it, but enough. Finally, Rachel whispered. My father made one mistake his whole life. Victor waited silently. He trusted rich people. The apartment felt colder after that sentence. Rachel slowly walked toward an old closet near the hallway. From the top shelf, she pulled down a dusty metal box. Victor's pulse quickened immediately. Walter's military lockbox. Rachel held it tightly. My father told me never to open this unless somebody came asking about the fire. Victor stared at the box. Why didn't you tell anyone? Because people died. That answer landed heavily. Sophie looked terrified now. Mom, what fire? Rachel looked at her daughter with heartbreak all over her face. The Ashford estate burned when you were little. I know that part. Rachel swallowed hard. But you don't know why. Victor stepped closer slowly. What was Walter protecting? Rachel hesitated, then finally handed Victor the lockbox. Inside were old photographs, financial records, newspaper clippings, and one cassette tape labeled, If anything happens to me. Victor's hands actually trembled. He found an old tape recorder beside the box and pressed play. Static crackled. Then Walter Mercer's tired voice filled the apartment. If you're hearing this, something finally caught up to me. Sophie covered her mouth instantly. Her grandfather's voice sounded alive again. Victor felt his chest tighten painfully. Walter continued. Richard Ashford stole millions from Hale Development during the expansion projects in '98. When Victor started getting suspicious, Richard burned the estate records before auditors could find the missing money. Victor closed his eyes. God. Walter's voice roughened on the tape. But the fire spread faster than Richard expected. One housekeeper died trapped inside. Rachel started crying quietly. Sophie looked horrified. Walter continued. Victor never knew because I made a promise to protect Rachel after her mother got sick. Richard threatened my family. Said if I talked, Rachel would pay for it. Victor's stomach turned violently. Walter protected everyone except himself. Just like always. The tape crackled again. If Richard ever comes after my family, give this to Bobby. He'll know what to do. Silence filled the apartment after the recording ended. Nobody moved. Finally, Sophie whispered. Grandpa knew this whole time? Rachel nodded tearfully. He thought staying quiet kept us safe. Victor looked down at the evidence spread across the table. 25 years. Walter carried this burden alone for 25 years while Victor sat beside Richard Ashford in boardrooms pretending they were friends. Self-hatred twisted inside his chest. Rachel wiped her eyes shakily. You understand now? She whispered. If Richard knows that tape exists. A loud crash exploded outside the apartment building. Everyone jumped. Victor moved instantly toward the window. Down on the street below, black SUVs screeched around the corner. Too many. Too fast. Victor's face darkened immediately. Because he recognized Ashford's security vehicles, and they were stopping directly outside the building. The black SUVs stayed parked outside Rachel Mercer's apartment all night. Nobody inside slept. Victor stood near the window in silence, while Sophie curled beneath a blanket on the couch, pretending not to be scared. Every few minutes, headlights swept across the walls, reminding them those men were still out there watching. Rachel sat at the kitchen table, clutching Walter's lockbox like it contained a live grenade. Maybe it did. By morning, Victor had already made 3 calls to federal attorneys, 2 investigative journalists, and the oldest judge he knew in Chicago. Because Richard Ashford had spent 25 years hiding behind money, and Victor Hale was finally done protecting him. 3 days later, the courtroom overflowed with reporters. Not because anyone cared about a maid accused of theft, but because billionaire Victor Hale had publicly filed fraud allegations against one of the most powerful families in the state. Richard Ashford entered the courtroom smiling confidently for cameras. That smile disappeared the second he saw Sophie sitting beside Victor. Rachel squeezed her daughter's hand tightly. "You okay?" she whispered. Sophie nodded, even though her stomach felt like broken glass. She had never been inside a courtroom before. Everything felt too quiet, too important. Victor sat beside them looking calm, but Sophie noticed the tension in his jaw. The old billionaire hadn't slept much lately. The guilt inside him had finally surfaced after decades underwater. The hearing began with Rachel's case. Celeste Ashford testified first. Elegant dress, perfect makeup, fake sadness. The necklace disappeared during Rachel Mercer's shift, Celeste explained smoothly. Security later recovered it from her locker. The prosecutor nodded. Open and shut story. At least that's what the Ashfords believed. Then Victor Hale stood up, and suddenly the room changed. Because wealthy men like Victor rarely testify against their own kind. "I'd like to submit additional evidence," Victor said calmly. The judge adjusted his glasses. "What kind of evidence?" Victor placed Walter Mercer's lockbox on the table. The courtroom murmured instantly. Richard Ashford's face tightened. Victor continued quietly. 25 years ago, Richard Ashford destroyed financial records during the estate fire investigation. Walter Mercer discovered the fraud, but remained silent after threats were made against his family. Richard stood immediately. "This is absurd." Victor ignored him. Then he played the tape. Walter Mercer's voice echoed through the courtroom. Honest, tired, human. Every word landed like a hammer. By the time the recording ended, even the judge looked shaken. Rachel cried silently beside Sophie. Because after all these years, somebody finally believed her father. Richard's attorney jumped up instantly, demanding the tape be excluded. Victor calmly introduced additional records from the lockbox. Bank transfers, insurance payouts, construction fraud tied directly to Ashford Holdings. Then came the final blow. A former Ashford security guard entered the courtroom unexpectedly. Older now, nervous, but ready. "My name is Daniel Ruiz," the man said shakily. "I worked as state security in 1998. Richard looked horrified. Ruiz swallowed hard. "Mr. Ashford ordered us to move evidence after the fire. And Mrs. Ashford planted the necklace in Rachel Mercer's locker last month." The courtroom exploded. Reporters shouted. Lawyers stood yelling over one another. The judge slammed his gavel repeatedly. Richard Ashford looked less like a billionaire now and more like a cornered animal. Victor finally turned toward him. "You destroyed innocent people to protect your image." Richard sneered bitterly. "You think you're innocent?" That hit harder than expected. Because Victor knew he wasn't innocent. "Not completely. I should have listened to Walter years ago," Victor admitted quietly. "I cared more about business than truth." The courtroom fell silent again. Victor's voice cracked slightly. And good people suffered because of it. For the first time in decades, Victor Hale looked ashamed publicly. Not polished, not powerful, just human. The judge dismissed the theft charges against Rachel immediately, while fraud investigations against Ashford Holdings moved forward. Reporters rushed toward Victor afterward. But he ignored every microphone. Instead, he turned toward Rachel. "I'm sorry," he said softly. Rachel stared at him for a long moment, then finally nodded once. Not because the pain disappeared, but because carrying hatred forever only creates more broken people. As they exited the courthouse, Sophie noticed dozens of cameras pointed at them. Her mother squeezed her hand nervously. "You ready for this?" Sophie looked up at Victor walking beside them. "No," she admitted. Victor almost smiled. Neither am I. But across the street, hidden behind dark car windows, someone else was watching them carefully. And Victor suddenly realized Richard Ashford still had one dangerous secret left to lose. The first thing Victor Hale did after the trial was shut down an entire board meeting halfway through a billion-dollar merger discussion. Not for business. For Sophie. Because while executives argued over profit margins, a 13-year-old girl sat alone in a hospital waiting room after Rachel collapsed from stress exhaustion. Victor arrived carrying vending machine hot chocolate and looking furious at the entire world. "She's okay," Sophie whispered quickly before he could ask. Victor nodded slowly, relief flashing across his face. Rachel had pushed herself too hard after weeks of fear, humiliation, and public attention. The body eventually collects every unpaid emotional debt. Victor sat beside Sophie quietly. Neither spoke for a minute. Then Sophie finally asked, "Did Grandpa hate you?" The question hit like a knife. Victor stared down at the paper cup in his hands. "No," he answered honestly. "That's the worst part." Sophie frowned slightly. Victor leaned back in the plastic hospital chair. "Walter had every reason to hate me. But he didn't." His voice softened. "Your grandfather believed people could still become better after making mistakes." Sophie looked toward Rachel's hospital room. "He used to say carrying anger too long turns your heart heavy." Victor smiled sadly. "Yeah, that sounds like Walt." For a long moment, hospital machines beeped softly behind nearby curtains while tired nurses moved through the halls. Then Victor spoke again. "I spent years building towers, companies, investments." He shook his head slowly. "But your grandfather spent his life protecting people." Sophie studied him carefully. "You protected us." Victor looked away immediately. Too much guilt still lived inside him for compliments to feel comfortable. A week later, Victor held a press conference outside the old Hale development building downtown. News crews packed the sidewalks. Former veterans lined the front rows. Rachel stood nervously beside Sophie, wearing a simple navy coat Victor's assistant bought after Rachel refused anything expensive. Victor stepped to the microphone slowly. For once, there were no corporate speeches prepared by lawyers. No polished statements. Just truth. 25 years ago, Victor began quietly. "A man named Walter Mercer saved my life more than once." The crowd fell silent. "He protected people when it cost him everything. Meanwhile, I protected my reputation because it was easier." Rachel lowered her eyes. Victor continued, "I can't change the years his family struggled alone. But I can decide what happens next." Behind him, a large banner slowly lowered from the building. "The Mercer F&O Veteran Housing and Family Assistance Initiative." Sophie gasped softly. Victor looked toward her. "This foundation will provide legal aid, housing support, and emergency assistance for veterans and working families abandoned by the systems meant to protect them." Applause broke out across the crowd. But Victor only cared about one reaction. Rachel's eyes filled with tears. "You named it after my father." Victor nodded once. "He earned it." Then Victor did something nobody expected. He handed Rachel the microphone. The former hotel maid looked terrified standing before cameras. But Sophie squeezed her hand. And slowly, Rachel found her voice. "My father used to tell me dignity isn't something rich people give you," she said shakily. "It's something nobody should be allowed to take away." The crowd applauded louder this time. Real applause. Not polite corporate clapping. Human applause. That night, Victor invited Rachel and Sophie to dinner at the mansion again. Only this time the house felt different. Warmer somehow. Sophie wandered into the kitchen and froze. An entire homemade pizza sat waiting on the counter, burned slightly around the edges. Victor looked embarrassed. "I followed Walter's recipe." Sophie burst out laughing. "It smells like smoke." "Your grandfather was a terrible cook too." Rachel laughed for the first time in weeks. And hearing that sound inside the mansion made Victor realize something painful. This giant house had been empty long before tonight. Later, after dinner, Sophie noticed Victor standing alone near the fireplace, holding Walter's old photograph again. "You miss him?" she whispered. Victor nodded slowly. "Every day." Sophie walked closer, then quietly slipped her small hand into his. Victor looked down surprised. "Grandpa used to say soldiers shouldn't eat alone." Victor's eyes watered instantly. Because after decades of wealth, loneliness, and regret, nobody had called him family in a very long time. And upstairs in the silent mansion hallway, an old grandfather clock finally began ticking again. 1 year later, Sophie Mercer still hated expensive shoes. Victor discovered that during the Mercer Foundation Gala, when she kicked off a pair of designer heels beneath the table and walked barefoot across polished marble floors. "They pinch my soul," she whispered dramatically. Victor nearly choked on his coffee laughing. The old billionaire laughed more now. People noticed. Reporters called it a transformation. Business magazines called it redemption. But Sophie knew the truth. Victor Hale didn't change because of headlines. He changed because one rainy night a pizza delivery girl knocked on the door while carrying Walter Mercer's heart inside her chest. The Mercer Foundation had already helped hundreds of families. Veterans received housing support. Single mothers got emergency legal aid. Kids who once skipped dinner now sat in after-school programs, eating hot meals, while volunteers helped with homework. And Rachel Mercer? She ran the entire foundation with terrifying efficiency. Turns out women who survive poverty become very hard to intimidate in boardrooms. Victor watched her during meetings, sometimes with quiet admiration. Rachel still carried herself like someone afraid life might suddenly take everything back. But little by little, that fear faded. Not completely. Maybe it never would. But enough. Sophie attended a better school now. Not a fancy elite academy full of spoiled billionaires' children. Victor offered that once. Sophie refused immediately. "I already know rich kids are weird." So instead, Victor funded scholarships at her neighborhood school. Because Sophie insisted helping everybody mattered more than escaping alone. That sounded painfully similar to Walter too. One snowy evening near Christmas, Sophie returned from school carrying a small pizza box. Victor looked confused when she placed it on his desk. "What's this?" "Dinner. You know I own 5 restaurants, right?" "Yeah, but this one matters." Victor opened the box slowly. Inside sat a slightly crooked homemade pizza, burned around the edges, just like Walter used to make. Victor went completely silent. Sophie sat across from him nervously. "My cooking teacher helped, eh?" "Little," she admitted. "Mostly with the parts involving fire safety." Victor laughed softly through tears. Then he noticed something written inside the lid. "Soldiers shouldn't eat alone." His vision blurred instantly. For a moment he couldn't speak. All the wealth in the world suddenly felt small compared to one handwritten sentence from a kid who refused to let lonely people stay lonely. Victor looked at Sophie carefully. "You know," he said quietly, "your grandfather saved my life in Vietnam." Sophie smiled softly. "And now I did too." Victor nodded. "Yeah, kid." His voice cracked slightly. "You really did." Outside the mansion windows, snow drifted gently across the city. But inside, the house no longer felt cold. The front doors stayed open more now. Veterans visited constantly. Neighborhood families came for dinners. Foundation meetings filled the halls with noise and life. The mansion finally became something Victor never managed to buy on his own. A home. Later that night, Sophie stood near the giant Christmas tree while Rachel helped volunteers organize donated winter coats. Victor watched them quietly from across the room. Walter Mercer should have been there. That ache would never fully disappear. But maybe healing didn't mean erasing pain. Maybe it meant building something beautiful beside it. Sophie suddenly ran over holding another slice of ruined pizza. "You gotta eat this before Mom throws it away." Victor accepted the plate with absolute seriousness. "Looks excellent." "It's literally burned black." "Perfection takes time." Sophie laughed. And hearing that sound echo through the mansion, Victor finally understood something Walter had tried teaching him decades earlier. A rich man isn't measured by what he keeps. He's measured by how many people feel safe when they walk through his door. And for the first time in his long, complicated life, Victor Hale finally felt rich. This story reminds us that kindness can come from the most unexpected people, and sometimes the smallest act of courage can completely change someone's life. Sophie was only a young girl delivering pizza in the rain, yet her honesty, love for her mother, and compassion helped heal a man who had spent decades trapped inside guilt and loneliness. In real life, many people are silently carrying pain behind success, wealth, or pride, just like Victor Hale. The story teaches us not to judge people only by their appearance, social status, or mistakes from the past. It also reminds us that loyalty, sacrifice, and integrity still matter in a world that often rewards selfishness. Walter Mercer chose to protect others even when life treated him unfairly, and his goodness continued living through his daughter and granddaughter. Sometimes the greatest legacy we leave behind is not money, but the way we make people feel safe, loved, and remembered. This story was created for educational and inspirational purposes, encouraging viewers to value empathy, forgiveness, family, and humanity in everyday life. If more people open their doors, listen with compassion, and help someone struggling quietly, the world would become a far gentler place for everyone. Personally, I believe stories like this matter because they remind us how easy it is to overlook people who are fighting silent battles every day. I think Sophie's courage proves that strength has nothing to do with age or money. To me, Victor's transformation shows that it is never too late for someone to become better. I admire Rachel because she kept protecting her daughter even while carrying her own pain. Walter Mercer represents the kind of quiet heroism society often forgets. I believe many wealthy people in the real world could learn from Victor's realization that success means nothing without human connection. One of the most emotional parts for me was seeing the mansion slowly become a true home instead of an empty symbol of wealth. I also think the story highlights how dignity should never depend on financial status. In my view, people heal faster when they feel seen, respected, and valued by others. More than anything, this story reminds me that a single act of kindness can echo through generations and completely transform lives. This story contains certain creative elements and the use of AI-assisted technology, created to provide meaningful entertainment while sharing valuable life lessons and emotional inspiration with viewers. Disclaimer: the situations, characters, and events presented in this content are intended for storytelling, educational, and inspirational purposes. Any resemblance to actual persons or events is purely coincidental. Viewer discretion and personal interpretation are encouraged.